Emphasis on bent, I think. Could you set the clock back to 30? I feel like an NFL ref now. Could you set the clock back to 30 minutes, please? I wanted to set the stage for the panel you'll be hearing in a few minutes, just by talking in general about knowledge management, basically some first principles on how we should approach an initiative or thinking about knowledge management for the Coast Guard or for any operation. And a lot of KM initiatives have been started on their own, for their own sake. So we need to get smarter at this. I talked to someone yesterday who said, I'm the KM stuckee from the organization. That's the common noun for a KM person. I'm the stuckee. These things are often taken on because it seems like the shiny new thing to do, so let's do it. I want to point us instead to my slides. I don't have slides. I have myself. There you go. I want to point us instead to resilience, to a mission objective. Everything you do in knowledge management, because knowledge management is an indirect value to things, right? We set the conditions for people to share information. Serendipitously, new things can happen. It's hard to justify the cost of that first step without aiming towards the mission objectives. So that's why I want to title this Resilience here. First, I want to give you my resume, very briefly. I first put knowledge management on my business cards in 1998 when that cartoon was written. I don't really take it personally, but you can see my career path. So we're talking about manage knowledge, right? And we know you don't actually manage knowledge. Manage, as it turns out, my friend Dave Snowden tells me, comes from an Italian word that means to deal with a horse, to guide and bring along a horse. So that gives you some idea what management does as a discipline, in addition to its product. But knowledge itself, we keep talking about as knowledge bases and various, as if it's a separate thing that sits on the table between us. I have some knowledge, it's on the table, I've codified it, and now I can hand it to you, and you have knowledge too. I've done some knowledge sharing. It turns out knowledge is actually biologically determined. It's in our minds. What you know about something is inescapable from your experience. You learn by metaphor, and you map new information onto what you already knew before. Affected by your biases, affected by your unconscious images of how things should work, affected by your worldview. You can't take it apart. You can't share knowledge. What you can do is learn. I can tell you something, or someone can tell you something, and you can then incorporate it into your own knowledge, in your own mind, applying it your own way. But it will never look the same. I can carry this around. So maybe it's more useful, because we could go on for days, and my friends here on the panel and I are part of a KM listserv that we talk back and forth a lot. And we could talk for months about the nature of knowledge and knowledge management. Trust me, because we've done it. Maybe it's more useful to think of knowledge as how it matters to the mission. Let's go back to getting something done. So knowledge in the sense of making sense of the information, and again, applying it to your own individual experience, your own individual filters, to determine a path forward. Knowledge in motion. I use knowledge to make sense of what's happening around me. I open my eyes, it's a brand new day, new things are happening. I use my knowledge to make sense of things, to apply it to current experience, to change my worldview if I need to, and then to choose a path forward. I think it's useful to have this in this construct because it leads you towards an action. It leads you towards making better decisions. So let's talk a little bit about how you make decisions. As it turns out, the way we make decisions is not what you've been told. If you ask someone, an expert, and again, knowledge management people, we've done this. We go to experts and say, you made this decision, you took this course of action. What really influenced you to do that? How did you look back on your decision there? And tell me the steps. And you will invariably get the 4 or 5 steps, the decision tree, the rational thinking that went behind their decision. I considered this option looked okay, but then I realized this factor would come into play, so I moved forward this way, and then I went here. Now, for some decisions, that may be true. The checklist manifesto tells us there are certain routines that make sense against a checklist. For the most part, though, when an expert tells you, especially in a complex situation, that what they did was follow a rational decision tree, that expert, unfortunately, is lying through his teeth. Literally making it up. Not his fault. Not his fault. Because it turns out all your brain does is predict. Some people have written that the heart of intelligence is just your ability to predict better. You're making decisions about what happens in front of you, about your role in the environment. You're going to step forward in whatever construct this is. And you're predicting that it's better to go this way instead of that. Now, this occurs constantly through the day. When you came in a door, you opened your hotel room door this morning, whatever the last door you hit. You decided that you didn't need as much force as might hit the wall. You needed enough force to get it open. And you didn't think about that at all. Your brain thought about it. Your brain solved that equation. And thousands like it every hour. Your brain solved that prediction that if I lean this much force and walk this way, I will walk through the door successfully. And by the way, if you are conscious of this sort of thing, of prediction, and you're right about something, you get a dopamine squirt, a little happy juice in your mind. I was right. I don't recommend this approach in a marriage to actually say it out loud. But that's what's happening. You get reinforced. I was right about something. Excellent. The role of emotion in making a decision, inseparable. There is no such thing as a reasoned mind, an emotional mind. We're all emotional. We're chemicals. So, Thomas Davenport wrote about the attention economy and pointed out something that was actually pretty obvious when you think about it. That these things, data, information, access to network, all accelerating beautifully. We can talk about the globalization, the connectedness of things. But we're not getting any smarter. We don't have an ability to pay attention to more things at once. In fact, there's no such thing as multitasking. What you do when you think you're multitasking is micro-slicing. You're paying attention here, and then here, and then here. If you're driving in a car and you're texting, stop it. If you're driving in a car in a conversation, you are driving in a way that your brain knows you would rather be paying attention to the conversation. So it begins to offload decisions for you. And I mentioned prediction before. That if you're conscious of a prediction, you get a dopamine squirt. But what happens in predictions that aren't conscious is if you're right, you never know about it. Your brain is a hierarchy. That information doesn't get to your conscious mind. If you're walking down the stairs, you don't think about your feet hitting the stairs until there isn't a stair. And then suddenly, your hierarchy is alerted that we have a problem with the foot zone. It's generally too late. So when you predict and things work out, you don't even notice. You go on automatic pilot. So you're talking on the phone, and how many of us have gotten home from work, pulled in the driveway, somebody said, "How is traffic?" And you said, "I don't know. Just kind of got here." You don't remember driving. Happens all the time. Because you were deep in thought or in a conversation, and your brain said, "I got this. Don't worry about it." And you can take that stroller. Hello? Hello, hello. Hi. And you can take that stroller out, so it's not a problem. I won't wake you up for that. I mean, it's a little dangerous, but you literally put it on cruise control. No multitasking for you. I took this yesterday. I was in the airport, the Reagan Airport. I was thinking about this notion of prediction. And walking through the airport here, and I like architecture, so I was staring at the ceiling, the roof there. And I was fascinated by it. And then I realized that I was solving massive equations. Because people were coming at me from the side, and you all know the idiots at the end. They kind of walk and stop because, "Oh, here," right in front of you, right? But I'm not conscious of that. I'm watching the architecture. I'm looking at Dunkin' Donuts sign. There's a guy at the end that really gets me. It's perfect for this demonstration. Oh, I'm sorry. I took this movie too long. I actually go to Dunkin' Donuts on this one. Sorry. But the point is that not only am I predicting the various people walking near me, can I make it? Do I have to stop? Do I have to let them go? But I also engage in what's called the theory of mind. I put myself into their minds, completely unconsciously. I decide their intent. She's looking at a magazine rack. She's not going to move. Oh, here comes a dope. He's not looking at all. I'll hold off. You're making those decisions all the while you're heading towards a plane. That's happening constantly. Gary Klein did some groundbreaking work for the Army in decision science, how people make decisions. He approached it as if people made rational decision tree decisions, right? Like we're told that things happen, like we write books about. And then he started working with people in hospitals and firefighters. And he ran across people, for example, this fireman that said, "I just have ESP. I have a sixth sense. I just know things." Well, give me an example. Well, we went into a kitchen fire, and my crew got to the living room, and I walked in behind them, and I said, "All right, get out, get out." Evacuated out. The living room fell through. If they'd been there seconds earlier, they'd be in the basement. Because the fire was actually a basement fire, showing itself through the kitchen. I just have a sixth sense about these things. People like me on their crew because I have ESP. So on the one hand, we have experts that say, I follow a very rational decision tree. And they're lying. On the other hand, we have somebody a little more honest who says, I just have a sixth sense about things. He's actually right. Because he's made decisions about what a kitchen fire looks like. Not consciously, but he's seen enough to know what they sound like. What's the sound level? What's the smoke level? And something in his mind said, this isn't what you think it is. And his training says, if you're in a building and you don't know the situation, get out and regroup. So his brain said, something isn't what it says it looks like. And his training said, get out. That was his sixth sense. But all of the pattern recognition is unconscious, and he can't uncover that. We talk about tacit knowledge. That's the tacit knowledge. You can't uncover that. When you see a baseball game, hope you're still watching, even though my team's not in it anymore. When the pitcher throws the ball, it takes roughly 0.35 seconds to reach the plate. It takes the hitter 0.25 seconds to execute a swing. I'm not great at math, but there's not a lot of time left over to actually decide to swing. And it turns out he's not starting that decision as the ball's coming at him. He starts it long before. The attitude of the pitcher, the situation of the game, the way his arm's coming back. He's seen this pitcher before throw a curveball. He knows kind of what the elbow looks like without registering it. He can't write this down. This is why pitchers move from one league to the other, do really well for a while because it's a new face. But people get used to them. Pattern recognition. This is how we work. We're very good at this. I won't go through this because I hate reading words on a slide, because it turns out if you read words on a slide to people, they can't understand it because you don't know what to pay attention to, and I lock your brain up. But this is the model that Klein developed that just said that we make decisions by recognizing something and by mapping it to what we already know. One more thing about experience. Cognitive resource theory finds that in a high-stress situation, there's nothing like experience. You want somebody really experienced in a high-stress situation. In a kitchen fire, you want a highly experienced person. Now, there could be a really smart person that's never been in a fire before. We all know the type. You don't want him there in the room with you. He may have some great innovative ideas, some creative solutions, approaches, but you want the experienced guy. That's obvious. We know that. Cognitive resource theory found that in a low-stress situation, experience kills creativity. Experience works against you in a low-stress situation. It doesn't make you creative because you've seen it before. You're less likely to recognize new approaches. And what's more, change is frightening. So anybody challenging your approach to something will scare you. You will come out against it. I offer that a low-stress situation may resemble this conference. And so the highly experienced here, who may be listening to some ideas throughout this week, may need to work extra hard to actually hear the ideas. Because your brain's working against you. It doesn't want you to hear new thoughts and new ideas about your job. Because that's challenging. So I've just laid out that individual knowledge management, we're good. Our brain has evolved really, really well. Even in this ridiculous world we have. There's a lot of talk back in my town, D.C., about the Founding Fathers and what if they were here today. The Founding Fathers were back today, they would scream in terror for months on end. Because giant cans are in the sky and people are in tubes running by and such. Nothing makes any sense. We evolved to understand our world. And our brains are pretty good at that. But then we join organizations. And we start to do this predicting behavior in groups. We get into meetings, we go to conferences, and we try to predict as an organization what might happen. We're going to watch a little prediction exercise here. And I want you to look at the gentleman in yellow. The boys in yellow are going to predict, based on their experience, based on their training, they're going to predict all the various things that could happen. Run it, please, Tony. Yeah, that's a completely legal play, right? What happened? Is the defense ever going to get fooled again on that? But look what they had to go through to learn it. In organizational learning, we talk about, apologize to my friend here, we talk about various ways of acting like a brain. We talk about single loop learning, which is simply that you have something, you have a task, an idea, you execute it, you watch what happens, and you execute the task again. It didn't work, try it again. Double loop learning says that you try a task, you execute, you see it didn't quite work, and you modify this part. Let's try a different way. So moving organizations from single to double loop is pretty important. There's also a triple loop learning. That is, how are we as an organization on that whole double thing? Do we have adaptable frameworks so we can change what's happening based on what we're learning? But look at all the things we go through to get the organization to act just like the mind. Just like the human brain. Because organizations, and this is a great quote, and I really have forgotten who said it. If anybody knows, please tell me. But there was a scientific experiment that was never run, because it didn't have to be run, because it was obvious. Put 10 chimps in a cage. At one end of the cage is a ladder, bananas at the top. And at some point, one of the chimps will recognize there's some food. He'll get on the ladder, and at this point, the researcher sprays them all with cold water until he comes down. At some point, they realize the problem is this guy on the ladder, and they pull him down. They dry off. Day goes by. Another chimp says, I'm going to try the bananas. Gets on the ladder, same thing. It doesn't take too long before any chimp that gets on that ladder is going to be taken out and pummeled by his friends. Because they just know something bad happens. And it happens to all of us. So stop doing that. Now here's the magic of organizations. Take that chimp out and put a new chimp in who's never been sprayed with water. He's going to head to the bananas. I'm not sure why you guys are ignoring the bananas, but I'm going to help myself to some food. He's going to get beat up. Over time, if you replace all 10 chimps with 10 chimps who have never been sprayed with water, you will have a cage full of animals who have never been sprayed with water and will never go near those bananas. It just doesn't work for us. It just isn't right. I stole that from somewhere. I don't remember where, but to me it defines organizational culture pretty well. We have shared assumptions that we don't question. So the triple loop and double loop learning methods are to try to get us to question what we know works, what we know doesn't work, because the world is changing, because things evolve. What are the impacts of this? My town, D.C., as you all know, suffered an earthquake this year. 4.8. It happened at 1:51 p.m., and the Office of Personnel Management, the HR eye in the sky for the town, decided at 4 p.m. that people could go home. Now, when asked why it took over 2 hours to decide that, someone on the radio, and I was driving and I heard this, I was in the disaster, by the way. My car bounced in traffic. No idea why. They said, well, we don't have an earthquake plan. This is D.C. Which tells you a lot about what you need to know about disaster response in D.C. We don't have an earthquake plan. We turn to the shelf. There's a gap where earthquake would go. This is the downfall of positioning yourself as purely a risk management regime. I've thought through all the possible things that can happen. I have op plans and op boards. We're good. Instead of positioning yourself for resilience. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to be disrupted. Morning of 9/11, and how many paragraphs start that way? I hope fewer as we go on. Morning of 9/11, D.C. did a very beautiful, wonderful thing. They turned all the traffic lights to green, headed out of town, so people could get out of the city quickly. Brilliant maneuver. Very good. Very quick. Didn't really help a lot because the military district of Washington closed the bridges out of D.C. Not a lot of coordination. Maybe that won't happen again. The same morning, friends of mine that worked with the Air Force Continuity of Operations Office, COOP office, their job, if there's a problem to the main command center, is to go to the parking lot quietly, get on a helicopter or a car, and go to another place where you can do your job. So there's continuity of operations. There's another agency called the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, and their job is to count noses in the parking lot to make sure that everyone's accounted for and everyone's gotten out of the building safely. Their job is to hold people in the parking lot. Here are two very important groups of people, organizations, with very noble missions, which are completely in conflict with each other. And both sides are armed. It actually was tense for a while. So here's some of the challenge. If anything I said is right. So as we talk about knowledge management and what we should do about it, how should we get better at sharing information, better at continuous learning, better at mission accomplishment, have we been focused on content to the exclusion of connections and interactions? I don't know the answer to that question here. I'm posing that as a challenge. It'll be a challenge to my panel later. But are we focused on the right thing? If these things are true, if our ability to predict as a group is based on interactions and learning from experience? This is a nice NASA shot of the 20th century. Shows you the urbanization, shows you the law of propinquity, that social networks gather by proximity, verifies for me the beer theory of civilization. It also shows a lot of the world that's in darkness. When the lights go out, they don't have an infrastructure to illuminate. Here's an image made available earlier this year, about 10 months ago, and I'm told it's out of date. This is the 21st century. The data points under this map are Facebook connections. Now you'll notice that China isn't really showing up real well here, nor is Brazil. So all of our talk about social media, 700 million people on Facebook, who are we talking to really? So conversations may begin to matter, and that might accelerate. In Fukushima, the seawalls around the nuclear power plant were built to 19 feet because that would sustain most planned tsunamis. Just as the Army Corps of Engineers built the seawalls for a Category 3 hurricane. Because most often, that's what you get. Now, back in Fukushima, because the walls were 19 feet, when I built a nuclear power plant, I didn't need to worry about the power. It doesn't have to go on the roof, like in some places. You can go on the ground. I got a seawall. Tsunami height hit 46 feet around Fukushima. Japan's broadcasting system, NHK, is 86 years old. They have positioned themselves to be a first responder for information. Unlike the seawall builders, they simply are ready to be disrupted. They had 14 helicopters on strip alert all around the island at all times. They have over 400 cameras around the coast, constantly shooting video of what's happening. They're tied into the national alert system. They're credited with saving 100,000 people because their alert went out long before anybody else's. They were on the air while the studio was still shaking. More than the strip alert and the cameras, there's other things. The anchors have to live within 5 kilometers of the studio, so if anything happens, they can run to work. And most importantly, after every evening's broadcast, NHK conducts a disaster drill. It's not an earthquake drill. It's not tsunami. It's not a nuclear meltdown. It's just disruption. We will have a disruption to the infrastructure. Now, I've mentioned content before as being something perhaps to be considered along with conversation. But it's not that content doesn't matter. One town was wiped out in the year 600. A couple thousand people. 6 survived. They built back near the coast. And in the 1930s, another tsunami wiped out the town and left 3 people. And at that point, they rebuilt up the hillside, uphill of this stone. And that's the only town that survived in that prefecture. So going back to first principles, going back to what matters, they found the content that mattered. I had a small hand in working with the DoD information sharing strategy years ago. And one of the great things that came out of that for me was a recognition on the part of DoD, learned the hard way, that not only do we have to get better at sharing information with the people that always tell us we don't share information enough, but we have to be ready to share data with people we don't know yet, in circumstances that we can't imagine. Pakistan comes to mind. And when I talk this week to some Coast Guard folks, I hate to say this, but it sounds almost like we have to start with sharing data with expected partners first. That there's the silo and a fragmentation in the culture. We know we're going to have to work together across sectors. So this is a lofty goal for DoD, and it remains a goal. But perhaps going back to first principles for the Coast Guard makes sense. Here's another example of a resilient organization. This is Walmart. During Katrina, when the hurricane was coming in, they have a 24-hour command center. I don't know why. There's a lot of frightening, why would Walmart have a command center? But they do. They have a national distribution network, GPS in all the trucks. They know the supply depots and the status. They know their employees live. They know where their stores are. So when they decided, we want to stay open, we want to provide food and water to the New Orleans area, to the Gulf Coast, actually. They simply plotted out where people live, where their stores were. They found gas stations in between, and then went to the gas stations and said, there's a hurricane coming. Would you like to stay open? Here's a free generator. The only condition is that one gas pump down there belongs to Walmart employees only, so they can get to work. That level of detail is possible because of the data awareness provided by their command center and their thoughtful use of data. Now, think for a second about their data strategy. They didn't put together GPS in the trucks and supply depot information to handle a hurricane. They just had the data. When you go after deciding what data you're going to have to what reason, towards what end, to answer what questions, you have to also position, you'll have the data for questions you haven't thought of yet. And that will hit you, the black swan of questions. Walmart is a resilient organization. A word about risk management, real quickly. This is from research that shows how various approaches to risk management apply to various levels of an organization. And the last one is sort of interesting because CEOs, the ones perhaps most responsible for survival, don't think about prioritizing, analyzing. They just want to be ready to adapt. They want to anticipate and adapt. Casinos, by the way, spend a lot of money on cameras to find the cheaters and the card counters. And yet, a white tiger mauls Roy Horn, and the casino loses $100 million. Another casino worker is injured in a construction accident, doesn't like the settlement he got, and was caught trying to dynamite the pillars in the parking garage. So, risk management doesn't capture all of the risk we have to think about. Risk management exists in some conflict with resilience engineering. They both can exist, but attention to both is recommended. So I've been saying resilience a lot, and I'm not going to say a lot more about it because, frankly, DHS, Coast Guard knows a lot more about resilience than I ever will. When I talk to folks about how the Coast Guard responds, a comment made to me, hadn't thought of it this way, that when something happens and you hear the Coast Guard had to respond, they weren't sitting in barracks waiting to be called. They were already doing things. They were already on site, drug interdiction, doing what they were doing. And they had to redeploy. So resilience for the Coast Guard, and perhaps for anyone, may really come down to improving our ability to reconfigure in response to circumstances. My last slide. I had the opportunity to speak to a rescue swimmer yesterday. And I will tell you, in any social situation, if someone says, so what do? And the answer is, I'm a rescue swimmer, that's the alpha in the room. You're done. Just back off. I didn't tell him what I was going to talk about. But I just asked him about his job. And he just offered up that I've only been doing this 4 years, so I'm not very good at it yet. But there's no training manual that tells you how to be good. He modified that, by the way, after a beer and became a badass. But still, he was when he started. But what he said was the ability to adapt and think out of the box. I drop in the water every time I board a ship. I don't know what I'm going to confront. I need to bring certain tools with me. My confidence, diplomatic skills, the ability to talk to people in stress situations. But there's no book that will teach you that. You have to live it, and it's only through coming into a situation knowing you will have to adapt that I can succeed. And actually, I am pretty good at it. This is my off-the-stage slide. Sorry. More reading. I won't read this to you. This is sort of a summary of what I've tried to say and try to lay the groundwork. At this point, I'd like to invite our panelists to join us on stage. Now, through the panel, there'll be questions, and ask a question anytime, either of me or of these nice people, and I'll give them a few minutes to introduce themselves in a second. There's mics right here at the end of the aisles. What I wanted to leave us with was the challenge. When we talk about knowledge management, if I'm right, if these first principles I laid out are true, what are the implications if we're going to try to consider how to do it here?